right. Hello and welcome to another episode of BSN's Long Story Short series. Today we're talking about DID, Decentralized Identification. This is a subject that has been discussed for many years, but with decentralized applications accelerating in the last few years, particularly around decentralized financial applications, adoption might be becoming less theoretical and more practical. To enlighten me on this subject, today we are joined by three experts: Markus from the steering committee, member at the Decentralized Identity Foundation. We have Drummond, who is the Chief Trust Officer at Evernym, and Daniel, who is a Senior PM at the Microsoft Identity team. Before we begin, it's always good to remind you that in the description below, you can find out all the information about the Twitter at BSN Base. You can find us on LinkedIn, and you can view the website. So now that we got that out of the way, I think we can start with some real basic introductions. And it would really be good to have some context on your roles within the company. So why don't I hand it off to Drummond, who can start us off?
Sure, happy to, Ben. So at Evernym, I play the role. It's called Chief Trust Officer, and that's because Evernym is a company. Our entire company is focused, was founded to work on decentralized identity, and what we call decentralized digital trust infrastructure. So my job is to concentrate on protocols and standards and all the elements that are involved with having that work interoperably everywhere. And so I actually work with both Markus and Daniel on standards such that we'll be talking about W3C verifiable credentials and W3C decentralized identifiers, or DIDs. And we'll be talking about those quite a bit.
All right. Thank you, Drummond. Markus, do you want to go next?
Yes, hello, I'm Markus Sabadello. I'm in Vienna, Austria. I'm founder of another decentralized identity company called Tech. We're a little bit smaller than Evernym, but working on similar topics, also contributing to standards and some proof of concepts and building technologies. And I'm also quite active in DIF, the Decentralized Identity Foundation. I'm a member of the steering committee there, and DIF maybe will talk a bit more about that later, but it's basically a place where a lot of collaboration is happening to build this new ecosystem and these new technologies.
Sounds good. Daniel, you're up.
My name is Daniel Buchner. I work primarily on the open source and standards side of our work at Microsoft on decentralized identity. Started there a few years ago with building out this team, and we now we're gearing up to sort of launch some products into the marketplace. And think that, decentralized identity is probably an idea whose time has come, just like the other panelists today.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. It seems like some of you may have had some experience and known each other before. So I will encourage all of you to interact with each other frequently, to either, ask questions or fill in on some other answers if you choose to do so, because I feel like that way the conversation goes natural. I think we should take a step back, though, at the beginning and kind of talk about how this decentralized identification comes into play with our daily lives and all the data that we have going around. So what is the play here with decentralized identification? Is it a trust play? What is the angle here? And this is something that anyone can take if they just want to start here.
Ooh, that's a pretty broad question. When I have to, I'm famous for getting out my number one and number two props. I'll actually grab them both right here. So we all actually know how to do decentralized identity today, right? When we have to prove our identity in the real world, we use credentials in a wallet someplace, right? And it's actually decentralized, right? I carry my own wallet. I keep it in my pocket. I keep all my stuff safe. I decide what credentials go in and who I show them to. An issuer of a credential decides, do I qualify to get that credential or not, right? And then when I go someplace, I got to prove my identity, like to get on a plane, the verifier of that credential, in that case, the airport security, decides what credential they'll accept, right? And then they make the decision about whether they'll accept it. There's no centralized authority involved. I carry my own stuff. It's pretty secure and private as long as they can believe the paper. What we don't have a way is doing that form of identity that we've proven for really centuries now on this, right? And so by being able to do verifiable digital credentials on our own devices, carry our own data with us, but have it be verifiable, digitally signed and verifiable. We just cut through so many of the problems we've had with trying to do identity centrally through big giant databases or what we call federated identity, which is using account in one place to log into a bunch of other places. But I mean, as soon as you describe that, you can see what the privacy issues are, right? Every time you use, Google or Facebook or LinkedIn to log into someplace, you're, being tracked. It's just, you can't get around it when you do that. But I'm not tracked when I use the credentials in this wallet, and a well-designed decentralized identity wallet, same thing would be true. So that's the way I introduce the topic, and then of course there's a lot of complexity behind that, but that's how a simple summary.
I think there's maybe some flavor I would add to that is, your identity. It's easy to think of it as just credentials, right? It's easy to think of it as just the things in your wallet, but really it's anything that can profile or identify you, anywhere in your life. And I think if you kind of zoom out, you'll see that there's so much other data you're interacting with apps and services with that isn't like the typical identifying data. It's not like your driver's license or anything like that, but it definitely identifies you. Most of the apps on your phone probably have a deeper profile than anything like your social security number, any of the sort of top level identity things could give you. Like, my grocery shopping lists that I carelessly write into one of the big 5 tech companies' apps, and I'm sure they're patrolling it constantly, is pretty revealing, right? Like if you can see someone's shopping patterns and all this other stuff, like it's a pretty good tell. So when I think of identity, I really honestly think of it as just like pretty much all your app data, everything that's ever recorded about you or that you exchange between someone else, because that could leak or, become public. And so from that perspective, like identity data is pretty much all data. I mean, it's hard. There's some data out there that isn't, but most data that people exchange becomes identifying. So it's just, I think, as much about apps and services and decentralizing away from the centralized silo models as it is about the way we form trust with each other, which is an aspect of identity, I think.
Thanks. Right. So I think one way of summarizing what both Daniel and Drummond just said is that what's happening, or what we're all trying to do, is make digital identity work in the same way as we're used to identity in the real world, right? Like Daniel said, identity is much broader than what we often think. Identity is not just my name and date of birth and citizenship, but it's really every aspect about me: social identity, cultural identity, everything that's me as a human being, right? And that's how it is in the real world. And digital identity systems should also be able to deal with all of these aspects of who I am. And what Drummond said is also about that, is also about making identity in the digital world work the same way we're used to it. And in the digital world right now, identity is not decentralized. We are dependent on large providers or centralized infrastructure. Sometimes we use strong metaphors, right, like digital slavery or things like that. And like Drummond said, in the real world, that's not how it is. Who I am is not dependent on a centralized authority, hopefully. So I think that's one way of summarizing that. And I also agree with Daniel that identity is a basis for a lot of other things, right? It's really underpinning everything, and maybe that's why there's such strong interest right now.
All right, thank you. That's really good for creating kind of a broader picture there. Now that we've kind of established what it is, it would be good to understand more about how you guys work with clients, right? I mean, obviously there's a business model here as well as just like a social solution. So I think we can start with Markus with the Decentralization Identity Foundation, right? What exactly do you guys do? How do you work with clients?
Well, originally a few years ago, DIF was started basically with the realization that there's a new thing coming. There's this great new idea. it's very, very powerful, both on the social and idealistic level, but also for businesses. We also realized there's a huge commercial potential. And basically we said we need to figure this out, and a number of companies and communities got together, and DIF became a place where we were able to quickly and efficiently work on specifications, on open source code, on all the different foundational building blocks and components that we needed to build. There's a lot of collaboration, because we're all realizing that even if we're building commercial products, we have to work together and build a shared foundational layer, and that's what DIF provides also to its members, a place to collaborate, to develop new ideas, and also build shared code and specifications, and also some activities, special interest groups where we just discuss also the needs or a topic specific to certain industries like banking, finance, hospitality, healthcare. So DIF is a little bit of everything: technical specifications, code, use case, interoperability discussions, and we think that's essential before we can really use the full potential of this. You're muted, Ben.
I sure am. It always happens once. Drummond, did you want to continue on that?
Sure. So Evernym's been active at DIF from the start. I was one of the founding steering committee members there with Markus and Daniel. There's several other the need to establish common standards and interoperability of this new form of digital identity is supreme. It's a little, I compare it a lot to what we had to do to standardize the web at the outset, right? You had to have browsers and websites know how to talk to each other, and it was important. It needed to not matter what browser you're using going to a particular website, right? And in the early days of the web, a lot of companies said, "Oh, we want everyone to use our browser," right? And companies started coming out with browsers just like the rest of their applications use our browser. And then we realized, wait a minute, that's not really a good idea. You want to be able to use one browser. And the same thing is true of the digital forms of these, right? If you need a different digital wallet for every site you're interacting with, you haven't really solved the problem. So we need to get common standards together for the digital wallets, and then how you issue the credentials and verify the credentials, how you store that data, as Daniel's talking about. These, it's an analogy, the whole wallet analogy, but if you're talking about all the data that you might process as an individual, then there's actually a lot more communications going on. You don't think about your wallet talking to other wallets, but with digital wallets, you actually have software there that is communicating and doing things like passwordless authentication, right? Where you don't need usernames and passwords anymore, because your wallet is storing a set of digital keys, and you can authenticate yourself much more strongly than you can trying to remember usernames and passwords. So there's a lot involved there. As we said, a lot of the standards work has gone on at W3C as an organization. And then composing and dealing with the non-technical part of trust, which is what we call generally governance. How does everyone agree on the rules? Who gets to issue credentials? What are the policies they follow? Who can, if you're relying on those, how do you deal with things like insurance, right? The foundation that you see here, the TrustRP Foundation, was started to deal with a lot of that. We work very closely. I'm in the steering committee there. It's about 18 months old now. We work very closely with DIF, with W3C, with other organizations in the space, OpenID Foundation, Open Identity Exchange. It's going to take a lot of collaboration to make this work successfully.
Okay, yeah, Drummond, that's really interesting, because I feel like the topics that you just brought up, I mean, they're usually topics that we spend an hour just talking about on their own. For example, things like interoperability, things like the insurance, right? I mean, these are all things that you guys are dealing with on a regular basis. let's take it to Daniel now on the same topic about, what is Microsoft's role? Because everyone's very familiar with Microsoft in the space, and then how are they involved in the DID space? I think that would be quite interesting.
Yeah, so Microsoft's been in the identity business for quite a while, long before I got to the company. I was at Mozilla doing browser stuff, and when I was at Mozilla, I sort of had this desire to, have apps that stored data with users and have identity that wasn't bound on some username that could be removed from you. And so went to Microsoft, and the reason I went there is I started researching a little bit about Microsoft and identity, and found out something I didn't know, that they actually have a huge identity services business, and that like most companies in the world, recognizable companies, use some aspect of their services, primarily this Azure Active Directory service. And so for that reason, I thought it was the best place to maybe go to get someone in the game who was influential in terms of a company. And really, it took a little bit of sales, but the sales pitch to them essentially from the business side is, look, like what we do today with identity in many of these IAM systems is essentially account management to centralized servers, for sort of like enterprise and silo specific use cases, which really isn't most of identity. I mean, this is a small fraction of identity. And if you want to open up your business model to being able to do lots of other things, there's basically identity is trapped in all of these silos out there. States can't talk to each other about identity information between each other. Businesses have a hard time setting up, these laborious federations where they have to like have direct connections to each other to exchange any data. And the promise here, I think, from the business side is that once DIDs and verifiable credentials are really ubiquitous, all sorts of things about identity that are paper-based and, or thought, just really analog processes of today can be digitized. And, someone's going to need to build the tools and host certain services and all of that stuff, because right now it's just strewn about in businesses and government agencies in sort of like one-off processes and services. And there's a huge opportunity to sort of uplift a lot of that into a standards-based, provider-driven or self-hosted ecosystem that kind of works together. So I think Microsoft looks at it as like, if you have a traditional identity business, maybe you could add a zero to that, in terms of the amount of revenue, if there was all those things were digitized that you have to currently fill out with paper, right? And it's just the same thing email did to letter writing. Essentially, we're just behind the curve 20 years in identity.
All right, that's great. Well, I think we should move to the next question here, because it relates to the host of this channel, which is the Blockchain Service Network. So we have blockchain technology. I mean, it kind of sprung up, really actively in the last 2 to 3 years around like decentralized finance and people using applications. And now we have these cross-chain technologies all competing together, right? So how do you see the role of blockchain technology going forward, and kind of what is your organization's involvement in that? Maybe we can let Drummond take this one, because I can see he's leaned forward in anticipation here.
Well, interestingly enough, all three of us share a base level perspective on that, which is why we have collaborated together for 2 years now, specifically on a standard that should be forthcoming from the W3C. The final step should be done by the end of September, and is called the Decentralized Identifier Standard, DIDs. We call them DIDs, really. DIDs or DIDs for short. We're really excited about this because I call it the atomic building block of decentralized identity. And it is, I like to point out, the first new identifier standard that the W3C, which is over 20 years old as an organization, the first one they've gotten behind since the URL, right? The addresses that appear in every one of our browsers that we're using every time we do anything on the web, right? And so you have to ask yourself, why would the W3C get behind this new form of identifier? And as simply as I can put it, the answer is because it is a cryptographically verifiable identifier, meaning if you have one of these DIDs, you can prove you control it. And the reason you can do that is because behind it one way or another, is a public and private key pair, right? There's no way we can explain this out. It's just covering the basic of cryptography, that everything with blockchains involves public and private keys, right? You have a key pair in a wallet, you expose the public key, and then you use it to sign things or encrypt things. And the private key is how you prove you control it. You do the encryption, others can decrypt it with the public key, or you sign it, or you sign something with a private key, and others with the public key can verify, yeah, you signed it. No one else could have signed it, right? So that's the essence of having control, digital control. And with decentralized identifiers, we said, hey, what if rather than going to some server, some registry someplace, like with domain names, and registering a name and having the possibility that someone could just take it away by turning off the registry, if that identifier is based on a key pair you control, then no one can take it away from you, right? You've got the keys, it's in the wallet, you create the identity, you either create it yourself or you create it in conjunction with a transaction with a blockchain. And now it's yours. You control it, and it's totally portable because you take it with you anywhere. Again, just like this, right? And now you can use that. You can see already how passwordless authentication would work. I have a DID that I use with a particular website. I can, anytime I show up at that website, if I sign a message into that site, they know, hey, that's got to be Drummond, right? Mm-hmm. But even better, they know, well, it's that DID. Well, the DID is a long string of characters. It doesn't give away anything about me personally, right? So I can have a different DID for every website I interact with, and guess what? My privacy just went way up, right? I can now reveal just what I need to reveal to every site, and we're just way ahead versus using the same login from some large provider every place I go, and my track, I'm just a giant tracking beacon. So I'm going to stop there, because between Markus and Daniel and I, we could talk about DIDs for the whole rest of this webinar. But they are, again, the core, the core building block. And even though DIDs don't require a blockchain, one of the most common forms of establishing a DID is using a blockchain, especially if you want it to be publicly verifiable by others. And Daniel should say something about the specific technology that he's been working on at Microsoft, SideTree and Ion, that is a specialized blockchain for dealing with DID.
Well, Daniel, I can't let you not say it after that introduction.
Yeah, so Drummond's right. Like I think we've really never had a system, of record for identifiers that is wholly the users. There's always been some sort of choke point. I mean, you see it in current systems today, like DNS. You get rug pulled from registrars. Certainly, people get rug pulled on social media, and that's it might be all right when it's all about your cat pictures on Facebook. But man, we really enter moral hazard territory when you start talking about adding a lot of entitlements to like real world critical services and needs to the existing identity infrastructure, because then, a post on Facebook that gets you banned from Facebook also makes it so you can't go buy milk with your WIC credits, which is probably the dystopian outcome we really don't want. So people need their own IDs. And we set out at Microsoft to, maybe something people really didn't expect us to do. I would venture, which was we went kind of the extreme angle of decentralization to say, like, we want to create a system. It's called Ion. And it uses this underlying protocol called SideTree, which can work across any ledger, but create an instantiation of it that is as decentralized as we could possibly make it. Like, we just wanted it to be so people certainly would know that it's not us in the middle. Like, we are not like some sort of trusted actor, like trusting Microsoft. So we created the system that's built on Bitcoin, and it's a layer 2 system. It isn't the blockchain itself. It doesn't have any secondary consensus or anything. There's no validators. There's no like trusted authorities or ring of people. It's literally just a mathematical protocol. So if you have the data and you're running the code, it's gonna give you the answer. And we want to do that for several reasons, like a couple that I mentioned, but obviously to make sure that the IDs that we give people, we can stand behind and say, look, there is no way, short of just like geothermal nuclear war, that this is going to get taken from you, or the $5 wrench. I guess you really can't get around that. But yeah, that's the idea, and we couldn't do that before because no system that we ever had, and this is really what ledgers do, is they create a sense of time. We've never really had systems that through consensus can give you like an event happened at time 1 and then a new event happened at time 2, and it's been recorded in this immutable history. And that's really the problem of PKI. And that's why today with DNS, you just trust some set of certificate authorities, because there is no sort of lineage that anyone can point to that's objective and, outside those bounds. We have to just delegate trust to say, what is the current key set or certificate for this name? And with blockchains, we don't have to do that anymore. So I think that's where they come in.
I can only emphasize what Drummond and Daniel already said. I completely agree with everything. Just to repeat again the importance of deeds as a technology and why they are so powerful. Drummond called deeds the atomic building block, or the essence of your identity. The technical architecture, it's at the lowest level is your DID, a type of identifier that works without central authorities, without intermediaries, that you can create on your own through cryptography, as Drummond has explained. So it's something that's not assigned to me, but something that I generate myself. I always like to quote René Descartes, the French philosopher from the Enlightenment period, who said, "I think, therefore I am." He didn't say I register at Facebook and therefore I am. So identity is something that comes from myself. The genesis step, right? What does it take for me to get a digital identity? That's something that should depend only on me and no one else. And DIDs are the basis for everything else. So without identifiers, you cannot have relationships, you cannot have connections, you cannot refer to each other, you cannot exchange data or messages. For all of that, you need some kind of identifier. And going back to the question about blockchains, so like Drummond said, deeds don't require blockchains. There are some types of deeds that don't use blockchains, and then there are types of deeds that do use blockchains. It's interesting to think about some of the essential properties of blockchains, right? They are complete transparency. Everything is visible that's on the blockchain, and immutability. So you can change something that's on a blockchain. And traditionally, both of those features are something that you don't want for digital identity, right? I don't want all my identity to be visible to everyone, and I don't want it to be immutable. But it makes sense for blockchain to be used for digital identity for some of these core features or core properties like DIDs, the identifiers themselves. For that, we saw blockchains in some cases as being a useful replacement for central registries.
All right. Great. I mean, you talked about the interoperability here between all of these different systems. It seems like Evernym, you're one foundation, and then Diff, you're another foundation, and obviously Microsoft with their own, the Eon blockchain, right? I mean, what are you guys doing right here to kind of make all these systems talk together? Are you trying to create something that everyone will work together? Or is it like what we've seen other technologies where maybe it's like a race and then one of them is going to succeed and other people kind of gradually, all right, well, guess we'll use that one too, right? So how do you kind of see this system playing out, and what are you guys doing to make everyone get along and work together?
I got to jump on that one right away. It's, again, using the analogy of the web. If the web was a race for everyone to use a particular kind of browser and a particular kind of website, it wouldn't be the web, right? It just, same thing with the internet. If everyone had a different way of plugging your computer to talk to other computers, we wouldn't have the internet. So we are absolutely after the same level of interoperability you have with the internet or you have with the web. Which we don't have. I mean, the ubiquitous standard for digital identity today, which, you almost have to laugh to say it, is the username and password, right? They work almost everywhere, and they've the whole companies whose whole job is to do password managers just to try and help you with that onerous task. So we're trying to say, hey, what we need to do is, once again, get to standardized digital wallets that can accept credentials and present credentials in a much more secure and privacy preserving way. Now that the DIDs underneath that handle the key management and the credentials, even those are just sort of the base layers for what you can build on top of that, right? We really, in my opinion, and I talk about this a lot, we're talking about the future, not just of digital identity, but a new generation of communications for the web, right? Because you can all now do secure messaging, right, between people and companies and our devices. And then relationship management, right? How we can relate to each other here, when we have these solid, secure, and private channels and ways of establishing trust between people with businesses. So many more processes can be digitized, as Daniel and Markus are saying, that we're just sort of unlocking this new. A lot of folks are referring to as a layer for the web, but that layer has got to be as interoperable as as the internet and the web. And again, with DIDs, there are over 90 DID methods. We call them methods. There are different ways of doing DIDs. The whole point of the DID standard is so they're interoperable. Markus can tell you more about the universal resolver that he's led the building of at DIF, which is, doesn't matter what DID a piece of software has, it just asks resolver, go, just like with DNS. Where's this domain name? Comes back with an answer. It doesn't matter where it is in the world. Same thing with DIDs, only the answer you get back is cryptographically verifiable. You know that that's the authoritative source for it. So that's the critical thing there. And then again, getting the credentials and interoperability between the wallets and the issuers and the verifiers, critical stuff.
Right, so there are these different layers typically, and Trust Over IP Foundation has developed a very useful model for thinking about different layers of the typical architecture, and interoperability. That question applies to each one of these layers, and also in some other ways. So there's not just one type of interoperability. Drummond was talking about the DIDs, which again are the basic foundational building block. And yes, there's the specification, and there's some tools, open source tools, like the Universal Resolver is one of the open source projects at DIF that makes it possible to be compatible with many different types of DIDs and many different networks. But that's one layer, right? And then there are other layers. There's the question of credential formats or signature types, proof types, protocols. How do wallets and organizations and companies talk to each other? How do these credentials get exchanged? On some of these layers, there's still a bit of work to do. I wouldn't say that there's a lot of competition, but in some cases there are some standards or specifications or ideas that are still evolving and converging, and sometimes overlapping, and that's exactly what organizations such as DIF or Trust Over IP or W3C are for, to figure out the interoperability and standardization of these different layers, so that eventually we'll have what Drummond explained with web browsers and websites all being able to talk to each other.
I do think there's a caveat, right, in terms of interoperability, where Drummond's right. And to build off something he said, the practical nature of this, there's like 90 of these dead methods. Now, the sobering reality, I think that we will see in the next 5 to 10 years is that there aren't going to be 90 dead methods in the end. There's just probably not going to be 90 dead methods, and the reason for that is because every DID method that is like a very serious DID method that can scale, that has like all the boxes checked, that's like done the due diligence, like I think you'll find in the end that running and operating nodes, which we hope people do, right? Because if you don't, I mean, you're going back to the old days. You just trust someone else and they tell you this ID has these keys, right? Is if you want to run these nodes, you probably can't run 90 of them. It's going to be very difficult. It's a lot of, people run, these cryptocurrency nodes, right? Like Bitcoin, Ethereum, all these other things. And even running more than a couple of them, at a time is tough for an individual. Now, companies can do it. Like Microsoft, we probably could run, I don't know, countless numbers of these DIDs if we really dedicate ourselves. But even then, it's still a huge ops cost. So I think what's going to really happen in every area of the stack, like DIDs, you might see like 3 to 5 DID methods that end up being, the most common ones that solve the 90% of the need. And, they're well recognized, and most sites can digest those DIDs and resolve them and get their keys, right? Like that's the reality if they're running their own node. And then with other things like authentication, like we do have a couple competing, sort of efforts, and maybe there's going to be 2, right? But there's probably not going to be 10. And we've just seen this in the way that, current authentication works. There's probably not going to be 10. There isn't 10. And that harkens back to the same things you see in traditional web, like TCP, UDP. And, there's not 20 of those. There's a few because people want to speak in a common language. So that would be the only caveat. And I think that's natural. And that's probably a winnowing effect of like, the years of the market sort of testing out solutions. And that's probably a good thing. But there is certainly going to be a shaping, I think, in the layers.
One interesting aspect of DIDs, and maybe one of the reasons why there are so many types of DIDs or DID methods is also that these the underlying systems that support DIDs don't necessarily have to be built for DIDs in the first place. So that means, for example, we have blockchains like Bitcoin blockchain or Ethereum blockchain, and there are types of DIDs that use these blockchains, but Bitcoin or Ethereum were never built in the beginning for DIDs, right? That's not built into these systems, but because of the way how the DID standard is organized and structured, it is possible to define a way to establish DIDs and work with them on top of these existing systems. There's also a type of DID called the DID web method, which basically allows you to take an existing domain name and turn that into a DID. It will also be possible to define a DID Facebook method, for example, where each Facebook username could become a DID, and that sort of undermines a little bit maybe the philosophy of DIDs and the ideals of user control and sovereignty and so on. But technically, this DID standard is flexible enough so that it can plug into all kinds of existing systems. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we see more and more types of DIDs coming up, and we'll see how it will evolve.
I don't know what you're talking about, Markus. I don't think Facebook would ever undermine user individual sovereignty.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question, which is like, you must be so wary anytime, like maybe it's like one of these public blockchain companies, or maybe like a commercial enterprise comes into contact with these organizations, because isn't there a bit of a very strong competitive advantage to be gained here, right? Or are you just more accepting of everybody that comes through?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll say, I'll kind of go back a little bit to our choice. And what we wanted to do was like, Microsoft could have very easily created, some shitcoin, right? Like we could have done that. But we didn't, because, the goal wasn't personal enrichment. It wasn't, we look at it as infrastructure. So what we picked was like the most robust system that we saw out there that had like the elements of security and immutability and, at the highest levels that you can measure. And for that reason, we chose Bitcoin. And so we kind of look at it as this humdrum thing where it's like, essentially the protocol pays in a pretty benign token that doesn't do too much. It's not like, it's not trying to have these crazy smart contracts, but we don't need that. What we need is blocking things in an immutable history. And it does that pretty well. So we didn't see the desire to jump in and, reinvent the wheel or do anything crazy. And so for that reason, we don't see it as a competitive advantage, like in that sense.
Another way to put it, Ben, is, when the internet was being created, right? We go back to that sort of starting point. I mean, there is a lot of money that was made, and there's still companies like Cisco that, that helped build it out and became the leading brand that companies would, buy infrastructure from or services from, right? And the same thing is going to be true here, but Cisco did not compete by having its own brand of TCP/IP data exchange, right? No, it actually competed the opposite. It wanted to be the most interoperable, right? So it's that kind of an infrastructure that we're trying to establish here. Now, on top of that, we're going to see, I predict, just thousands of new apps, new services, new companies. Who will be the eBay of digital trust is wide open, right? That's what's exciting about this new area, and that's where you can start to see sort of the blockchain community and all the, for instance, excitement around DeFi intersecting with and expanding with, and going, well, no wonder they're so excited about decentralized identity and vice versa, right? I like to point out, do I use this little instrument for identity or do I use it for money? Right? Of course I use it for both. And your digital wallet, your keys are going to be in there, whether you're interacting with a blockchain, you're exchanging cryptocurrency, or we're saying whether you're interacting with issuers or verifiers of credentials, or when your DIDs become your cryptographic address book in this device, I'm going to be doing my communications with it, right? I'm not going to have to use 6, that's how many I use right now, secure messaging apps. I should be able to use secure messaging the way I use email, right? And talk to anyone else using, it's actually a project at DIF called DIDCOM. Guess what? It's DID-based communications. So now you're getting to the really exciting potential of what we call layer 4, right? The application and what we call digital trust ecosystems that will be built with this. And I want to reinforce, this isn't theoretical. Some of those digital trust ecosystems are already out there. They're already starting today. Verifiable credentials are being adopted in certain industries like finance, right? Credit unions, financial cooperatives have established a common credential called a member pass that there's already, there's getting to be over 100,000 of those that are now issued out there in people's digital wallets. So, and we're seeing adoption in the travel industry to deal with, proof of COVID testing or immunity. This is something we really need to reopen the economy. So, it's happening. This isn't theoretical at all.
Yeah, one thing I kind of lament is that in the blockchain sphere is that they kind of captured the word DApp to really mean like this very narrow thing, which is like decentralized finance, compounded interest, layered 4 times CDO, prepackaged debt obligation instrument. And I'm like, wow, that's dApps. That's all dApps, huh? Mm-hmm. When I think about dApps, I think about like, what if we took some of the apps today, normal apps that non-nerdy people who aren't sitting at a trading desk use every day, and we decentralize them? I was like, that's kind of always what I signed up for. So, what I want to see is like the decentralization of Twitter and the decentralization of social media and, and elements of travel and like things like that. And I think one thing to underline is that when we have DIDs and VCs, there's this third element, this personal data store element that we're also working on that kind of is the thing that greenlights many of those traditional app decentralization cases. And for the example of Twitter, Blue Sky, Jax, has the Blue Sky initiative going. I think they're probably going to make some announcements at some point here soon. They want to decentralize Twitter. And what do you need to do that? The first thing you need is you probably need like an at name that can't just be erased from history. Because if people are following a name that could be rug pulled, do you really own your identity, your connections, your followers, all the things Drummond said? No, not really. Right? It's some companies. So we need that to be based on DIDs. And then once I have an ID that people can follow that's mine, not Twitter's, how do they get my content? Right? How do they go get my tweets? How do they visualize what I'm trying to post to the world? Well, we think that's probably going to be these personal data stores where you might find someone's ID, you follow it, periodically you're going to go to their data store, pull their latest feed, whatever they've published to the world. And those data stores should be as decentralized and robust as the IDs themselves. And so once you have those two pieces, you can kind of reimagine a ton of apps because they start storing the data with you, the user, and users start connecting more directly to each other. And that really is, I think, what unlocks a world where we don't see so much surveillance capitalism and the things that we're seeing today, because the app infrastructure fundamentally is built on tracking ads and centralized identity.
Well, the way I would put it is that we're trying to decouple identity from applications, right? We're used to architecture of the web where that is often the same thing. So I go to Facebook, and that's a social networking application, and it's also where all my data is. I use Google Docs, and that's an application for writing up something, but it's also where the data is. And what we can do with the IDs and related technologies is, first we have a place where I control my identity and my data in a wallet or in a personal data store or a data hub. And then applications can use that, but the application is not coupled to that. I can decouple that. I can control my identity and data separately from the choice of which applications I want to use.
Yeah, that's something, like, I know that Drummond was mentioning that it's already happening. And I know even from things like single sign-ons and things like MetaMask already, like people are definitely looking for websites that they can go to and skip the whole username password, right? Just log in directly with MetaMask. So yeah, I think that we're getting much closer, and it makes me want to dig a little bit deeper. I know that Drummond had mentioned some less obvious uses of this technology. So maybe Drummond, if you could share some things that people are using DIDs for that maybe we don't think of right away. Obviously, like things like the KYC, these kind of documentations, that kind of leaps to mind immediately. But maybe what else is out there for people using DIDs?
Well, there are a couple different, the two examples I want to cite that sort of start to push the envelope when you think about, decentralized identity. So one is we think about in healthcare, and I thought it would take a lot longer for healthcare to get excited start to get a foothold for decentralized identity there. But it turns out it's actually, as an industry, it's one where you've got extremely sensitive personal data, your health records, and the need to share it in order to to do things like get healthcare, or in the case of that we're dealing with COVID, prove certain things about yourself in order to be safe in society, right? And travel, go to work, things like that. So and it turns out patient identity is a huge deal. There are whole companies, in fact, an industry around what they call patient ID matching, because it's critically important that your healthcare data be private, but when you go from one health facility to another, like an emergency in another town you're traveling to, that they really be able to know it's you. And, as they say, they're cutting off the leg of the right person, right? Or the arm or the finger or whatever. So it's really, really critically important. So it's already gaining a foothold in healthcare. And one of the things I think is most exciting is what this company called Lumedic that's leading in the US initially, patient-centric data exchange. So if I get a test, for instance, I get a credential about that test right into my digital wallet. I can then I don't have to go get one doctor to talk to another doctor. I can walk into another doctor and go, here's the test, and it's digitally signed by whoever issued it, such that any doctor I take it to can verify, here it is, here's the data. You didn't, and you're literally carrying it with you, or you've, as Daniel said, it's in your, if it's a large test or an X-ray or something, you don't want to carry it around on your phone. It's in your data hub, and it can be easily referenced, and you give out permission rather than have to go to a hospital to do something like that. So that's one example. I want to talk about one that even goes much further out there. When you talk about one of the most common and valuable form of credential we have out there. You have a whole system that's evolved to use it. Very expensive credentials is educational credentials, right? All the way up to university diplomas. It's a very ancient system that needs digitization in some bad ways. Just not to make it easier to use, but to start to open up education to a much broader set of life skills than just what you can get in traditional educational channels. So there's a hugely interesting, fantastic project at Trust Over ID, digital trust ecosystem called YOMA, stands for Youth Marketplace. It's being funded by UNESCO, and it's designed for youth in Africa to be able to start to acquire skills and improve, skills in the real world. Some of them are digital skills, but some of the real world skills, whether it's, farming or agriculture or water cleansing, whatever it is. As they prove out and learn those things, they're able to get credentials, not just credentials, but also credits in the YOMA system. So it is blockchain based. It has an associated, I don't think it's a dedicated token, but it's within a system that uses tokens. So now you've got an entire alternative educational ecosystem with credentials that youth can earn and then use to not only trade, but then work their way into better jobs and more economic opportunity. It's a fantastic example of the kind of value that can be unlocked with this new infrastructure.
Drummond, I love that you brought that up, because living abroad, one of the processes I'm going through right now is procuring a visa, and like a working visa extension, and the amount of work to verify, obviously out here in China where I'm based, is a multi-step that includes photocopies, signatures, stamps, checks to bureaucratic branches, right? And this is a perfect example of just how hard can it be to verify that somebody went to this university, this many years ago, right? So, that one hit close to home. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I think Daniel, the core use case is it just, right now the diploma you get is just an ornament. It's just crazy that, and there's sort of this liar's ability to kind of squint and say, oh no, we've solved that. There's a registrar and you send an email or you do some communication, maybe it's your process you talked about is very elaborate, but even in the most simple case, a prospective employer has to contact someone at the university and make physical human contact and have something processed by a human to then go and do this. And it's insanity. It's just it's pure insanity. And that's kind of brings it back to the business question of this is it's funny how people say there's no money in decentralization. It's yeah, sure there is. Sure there is. If you look around at all these processes and these businesses, I can tell you there's some at Microsoft, that's for sure. They're so long in the tooth. We have departments that are trying to talk to each other doing the same exact things because Microsoft's so big. And it just looks absurd when you zoom out. It looks like the world did before email. Where you're just what? I have to send a letter and I'm waiting time and why? What am I doing? So I think that's what we're really doing with decentralized identity is we're bringing the world to in the last 20 years to what email's done to paper mail. And we just lagged it by decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to point out something. There's a reason we lagged it. Trust, right? We didn't have the way to do it in a trusted manner. So that's why we're unlocking all of this with decentralized identity and those keys. I totally agree with Daniel. And when people ask me, well, why is it taking so long? It's solving that problem. It's a hard problem, and that's why it's taken a bunch of us to work together on it. But it's exciting that we're right on the verge now of unlocking this whole new layer of value.
Yes, exactly. We're getting close to the end of the hour here, so I might have to speed things up. But I did want to talk about two very topical issues that kind of touch on social impact before we wrap up. One of them, we'll start, I guess, it has to be mentioned, I guess, is COVID with all the contacts tracing. As somebody who must have observed a lot of these medical tracking systems before in a conceptual phase, what is your view on how things are being handled now in your respective regions? And do you find yourself feeling frustrated that we haven't used technology to accelerate this process better, or are you thinking, wow, they're doing a good job on that? I'm very curious about your thoughts here.
Well, I just want to quickly say that when COVID hit, within about 2 months, the decentralized identity industry coalesced an all-volunteer effort involving over 300 people to say, hey, we're going to need COVID credentials. We're going to need verifiable credentials for proof of either a testing status, vaccination status, recovery status, and they better be verifiable credentials that are under our control and have all the privacy controls and everything else for obvious reasons. So that's emerged into something called the COVID Credentials Initiative. There's been a ton of work around At Trust OVP, we just had over 50 companies come together to develop an initiative called the Good Health Pass, and a blueprint for how to get interoperable COVID credentials. It should be. I'm hoping the final blueprint should be announced by the end of the month. So it is a critical area where we can put this technology to use, and it's not going to stop. It's not going to do anything about the Delta variant or any of that, but it's going to help give us a tool for dealing with it as a society. And it's ironic that it's turned into like the easiest way to explain decentralized identity and verifiable credentials ever. I mean, I can literally, in one sentence, someone says, well, how do you prove you're vaccinated? And they hold up the little paper card and I go, you can go on eBay and buy one of those things for about $1, right? So it's if we don't want to have real faith in that, we need verifiable credentials to do that.
Here in the EU, there is a technology, or there is a digital version of a vaccination credential. It's called the Green Pass, so that is working. It's available. It does not use these technologies yet, unfortunately. So it's based on more traditional technologies and architecture. So it doesn't use the DIDs and the verifiable credentials and DIDCOM and all of those things that we are working on. But at the same time, the EU Commission politicians are very much dedicated to the vision of individual empowerment and control for digital identity. There's recently been an announcement that digital wallets will be available for all EU citizens in the next few years, and then you will be able to do what we are talking about, to be in control of what credentials you use, when, and with whom you share them, and not just for vaccination credentials or education credentials, which, by the way, is also a big topic here. There are several interoperability projects between universities and digital diplomas in different EU member states. But so the current implementation of this digital green pass for COVID does not yet use this, but we'll be ready for the next pandemic. There is very, very strong support here from the top EU leadership to really adopt these decentralized identity technologies in the next few years.
It's good to hear. Okay, last point here before we sign off. This one's more geopolitical, perhaps. I mean, we recently saw the situation with Didi doing the IPO in New York, and then that caused a huge outlash back in the mainland China about user privacy. We've seen other things with Huawei before in the past about this sort of thing. Do you see decentralized identities resolving this, or do you feel like governments will be uneasy about where this this identity, this private user data is ending up? What are your thoughts on that? I'll let anyone take this. Feel free to go nuts on this one.
I think Daniel has some unique views on the role of government in our lives.
Go for it, Daniel.
No, I feel like Drummond's going to give probably a more kosher answer to this. I could give an answer, but I'm not sure I'd give a Microsoft approved answer. So I'm going to defer to you.
Well, what I would say is that once again, for the last time I'll do this, no government complains that I have a wallet into which I put my credentials and I control where they're used, right? It's pretty well, some governments do say, hey, there's a standard credential we issue of some government ID and you need it for certain services. So essentially all we're doing with decentralized identity infrastructure is saying, hey, that's what as citizens we should be able to have and be able to control our information. The vast majority of governments in the world are like, yeah, that's a good thing. Privacy has become a real issue, right? And the surveillance economy, all the tracking that's going on, it's something we need to solve. And it's also, highly beneficial. Almost, I don't think any government would complain that we need to, the more they can do digital transformation on their economy, on their government services, and the more they can enable their citizens and businesses to be to go digital and be more efficient, the greater the economic output, the greater the more successful the country is as a whole. This is a key enabling technology for that. So will it put citizens and individuals in charge of their own keys? Will they be able to protect their information? Absolutely. It's a little bit like saying, yeah, you got to be connected to the internet to use the internet. But will the overall benefits to the governments and the citizens be outweigh the costs or the ability for people to control information? I think there's no question. So we'll just have to evolve, new and ways of maintaining trust and dealing with, criminal or terrorist activity.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess I suppose I would add, I think everyone recognizes that decentralized identity doesn't mean a 10-year-old is going to be able to go out there and self-attest that they can, drive a car or something like that. There's going to be authorities. I would hope they would be as localized and as localized and community-centric authorities as possible. That's my own personal, view. But there's going to be someone that says who can drive and who can't. And that's a good thing. And I think the government has a role to play, and I hope it stays in that lane of doing the things that it should, and maybe not imposing potentially new identity strictures on us that are unnecessary. I mean, that if I had to say what is my fear, is that they use it as a reason to make identification ubiquitous in areas where it really doesn't advance society or people's lives. They just do it for purposes of filtering for other things. So yeah, I mean, I think we have to be very careful, we have to be vigilant as technologists, as a society, to make sure the technology is used in the appropriate ways and not in the ways where it could, potentially be harmful.
Traditionally, governments have always had an interest in collecting centralized information about their citizens. Right? Historically, the reasons are mainly taxation and military service. In order to implement those functions of a state, you need to know of who lives in your territory. Right? That's why census was started and why governments started to collect data about their citizens. Here in Austria, it's illegal to not have a name. If you have a baby and you don't name the baby, then the state will assign a name to the baby. So I think this kind of state collecting data about the citizens will not go away. There's some legitimate interest in that, I think, but I also think more and more governments are realizing that this idea of individual sovereignty and decentralized digital identity doesn't mean that we want to stop recognizing legitimate authorities. It does not mean that we want to stop paying taxes. It just means to rebuild a little bit of the way how identity works in the real world, individual dignity, human rights, to put a little bit more control into the hands of the individual, of the citizen, and that's why a lot of governments are actually very supportive of this.
Yeah, and I think that's a good reason why people, who might be listening or watching in this case, it's a good reason to be involved and like Daniel said, be vigilant as technologists. So I think that's a good note for us all to end on. And I want to thank everyone once again for joining us. I think, no matter how long we talk about this topic, there's always things to do. So hopefully this won't be the last time that our paths cross. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.